So let's go live. All right, welcome back. We are COMP125 in the summer 2020 semester, and it's week 8, part 2, even though it says part 1 of our broadcast. And part 2 is all going to be around Ajax and JSON. Okay, so last day what we talked about, if I'm just going to go back to our project, we were working on object-oriented programming with JavaScript, and we created a contact class, which is what we did right here. And I discussed things like there's a disadvantage and advantage to doing it this way. There's an advantage because the great thing is you have lots of structure. However, when it comes to saving data, you can't really save out this kind of data straight. You have to convert it to something. And one of the ways we can convert to a format that is usable for us is JSON data. So that's JavaScript object notation, which is what we were actually talking about as an alternate to doing it this way. So let's suppose we're back inside of this. Again, I'm using the project from last day, so COMP125 M2020 lesson 8 up on GitHub. And you can see here's the contact form, and we've done some validation. And then what's happening is what we're doing is we're building up our contact. So we've instantiated a new object, which is our contact object. That's what it is. So contact itself is an object of type contact. That's what it is, right? And then what we're doing is with this contact object, we are describing or placing values on all of the properties for the contact class. First name, and then we have last name, and so on. As we validate the form, we're doing form validation at a very high level here. And then we're validating, we're doing a contact number and everything else. And there's a lot of duplication here, all right? So again, one of the mottos is make it work, right? Make it work. And then refactor. Okay, so we're going to do some of that today, hopefully. And then finally, we're outputting to the console our contact object. But it would be nice if we can convert our contact object into a format that we can save to a file. And once we start doing that, once we load our contact object or save our contact object into a file somehow, we can't do that without a backend, unfortunately. We need some kind of thing, whether it's PHP or Node.js or some other backend, a .NET backend, whatever. But you can't directly access a file on your website. Can't do it. You can load it, but you can't save it. And so we come to these words, loading and saving. And it's not really loading and saving, but rather it's serializing and deserializing. Encoding a file and decoding a file, right? We want to encode it in a format that is in a data format that we can read in again, right? In C#, we can encode it as a string, and we can decode it as a string back in. We can encode it as a binary file. We can decode it back as a binary file, no problem, right? Encoding and decoding, serializing and deserializing. They mean the same thing in some ways. And so we do the same thing with our data. We have to encode our data as either XML or JSON. Now XML, over the last little while, and it stands for, basically it's another format. XML is a markup language, right? And what it is it basically creates these elements. And you guys have seen XML before. Let's just look for XML online and see what that looks like. So if I said XML, what is that, right? And again, I'm showing you this because it's just easier to show you than. So you have. I want to see if there's a kind of example that I can show you. But more or less, it looks like HTML, right? It's originally was created. When it comes to XML, to kind of present as HTML. So here's an example of some random XML that I found online. And if you notice, there's an opening element and a closing element. Closing element at the bottom, opening element at the top. You have an opening element here and another closing element there. And then between those closing elements, you have data that is layered, as an example, kind of in different levels. Yeah, that's cool, but then you have a lot of syntax here. So people kind of looked at this and they're like, wow, that's a lot of syntax to save a little bit of data, right? Sure, it makes it easy for us to identify what the data is this way if you know how to load in the XML file, but it's really wordy. And even if you have some simpler examples, here's maybe a simpler example of products, and then you have a product, so the products array, and this is an XML example, and you have product, another product, and so on. But it's better and easier by far if we use JSON, right? So if I do JSON data, let's take a look at what JSON looks like. It looks kind of like what we've been using, and again, I'm just picking random JSON files, and you tell me what it looks like for you. So here's an opening brace, right? And inside you have an orders array. I'm just, again, randomly picking up JSON. You tell me what's easier to read. Less syntax, there's less markup, and it's clear, a lot more clear what the where the data is, right, in some ways. So we need a format, some kind of data format, and it seems as if JSON has won the day over several years, and it's become the data format of choice, JSON data. And it's going to look like this when we save and load or serialize and then deserialize the data where we store it. So usually we store this data or get this data from a database, as an example, and you guys should know a little bit about databases by now. But how would we do it here? So here, how does it relate to what we've been doing? So we have a contact, and we've been doing this kind of stuff where we kind of get our contact, we've been putting it together, and we have this toString thing, right? And so there are, in the document that we've been looking at for our not this one, in our PowerPoint, we've been looking at, if I go to page 60 in our PowerPoint here, it talks about how to serialize and convert not just to a string, but later on into JSON data and JavaScript object notation, right? So where we parse a string and it converts a string into an object, or we stringify an object back into a string. Okay, so those are the two kind of built-in methods that are part of the JSON object. We talked about using object-oriented programming part 2, which is using built-in objects. JSON itself is an object. I pronounce it JSON. Some people say JSON. I like JSON because it's just easier. So here's JSON.stringify. That's the way it's working. So we use the JSON object and we use the stringify method, right, to basically take a value, so JSON data, and convert it back into a string. That's how we use the JSON stringify method, right? So this deserializes it or turns it into a string that we can do something with. As an example, well, actually, in some ways it serializes it too, because it makes it into a string and it can't be used for data. Okay, but strings can be output nicely to the console. They can be used in different ways. And once it's a string, I can measure the length of the string. I can do stuff with that string that only we can do with string things, as an example. Add to the string, append to the string, and so on. And you can't do the same things with JSON data. So example, we might have kind of an object, a very simple object with first name and last name, Tony Chu, and then what we want to do is take that object, right, as an example. Remember, this is good enough for an object. That's all we had to do. Curly braces and equals, that creates an object with a prototype of object as a superclass, right? Not contact in this case, right? That's okay. Once we make an object, then what I can simply do is stringify it, right? I can convert it to string, right? And create this new string object. New string would take the original object, which is this, and turn it into a string, and then the value would look like this. It would just be a string that looks like this. Okay, so kind of very straightforward. At the same time, we want to do the other way around. We want to take a string, right? Here's a string. We pass a string that is formatted properly. Okay, we want to format the string right. We want to take that string and convert it into an object, into a JSON object. Okay, take a string, convert it into a JSON object. And once we've done that, now that is an object that we can use. It's something that we can tap into. We can access as properties and methods of that object. We can do all kinds of stuff. So if you think about it, we can create an inner method that does the same kind of thing for us for our contact object. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So if I could take my contact, so in my contact.js, that this is sitting in contact.js inside scripts, right? And right now I output a friendly, toString method that you can use to output this to the console. Yay! It's wonderful, but useless. I mean, it's really useless from a data transport perspective. You can't really do anything with this. And sending out a contact over, yes, we can totally send an object. It'll take any object and it's packed full of information. But sometimes what we want to do is convert to JSON. So how would we convert this thing to JSON? Well, there's two. One, I can directly create a JSON, almost like a, kind of file. So let's make a new method. As an example, we'll call this, toJSON. Come on. toJSON, right? It's a new method that we're making, right? Remember, in an object or in a class, in JavaScript, we don't have to use any kind of function or whatever. Anything that's inside of the class curly brace. And again, I recommend formatting your class so that you can, in Visual Studio Code, so you can see the curly braces start and end, even this part. It's always best if you could format Visual Studio Code to have curly braces on top of each other so that you can see the start and end. For everything, by the way, I prefer it this way, right? Because then you can, kind of go through and go, okay, look, this is this curly brace, this yellow line. This yellow line is the blue curly brace, start and end. This another yellow, and you can see where the things start and end. Some people even go so far as to say, end constructor. They do one of these kind of things where you can the end curly braces have a little comment that talk about what the method that they're closing is, or function, or whatever it is. Okay. But if you line it up like this, it's really clear. And the next thing is you can always, kind of comment out one part, but the curly braces remain, and you can swap out the signature with something else, which is where I think good coding comes from, right? So I want to do the same thing for my toJSON method. So this is a new method that I'm going to make, and I'm going to convert my class-based prototype to a JSON file, a JSON output object. So without me having to do any kind of necessarily parsing or anything like that. So remember what we're going to return then, right? I'm going to return the JSON object. That's what I want. I know that that's what I want to do. JSON object right now doesn't exist. Okay? There is no JSON object that exists. Let's spell it properly too. JSON object. That's how it should be, right? We don't have this right now. So let's make it. Right? So we're going to say something like, hey, our JSON object, right, is going to be equal to curly brace. Right? We can do that. So now all of a sudden we've got an object. If I hover over this, it's an any object. We don't know what type it is, but it's an empty object. Okay? And what I could do, right, is right in here, instead of me, kind of assigning values one by one, I could start defining this object right away. So for example, I know that my JSON object should reflect exactly the object that I have in my contact, right? So I want to do all of this, first name, last name, and so on. I want to grab all this. This is really key, actually, and put it in here, but we're going to convert it because this doesn't make any sense for JSON, dots and this and all that stuff. But we know we're going to need these things. So the best thing to do is start off. And again, I'm just converting from my, kind of one prototype to another. So I know these are the object names. And instead of equal signs in JSON, we're going to use colons. Okay, so colon replaces equal sign. And actually, you can do a kind of a find replace, Control F, find replace. You can just kind of look for equal sign. And again, you want to find it in here. You don't want to find it over here because that would replace everything that looks like an equal sign. And you can use a regular expression. We can match the whole word, and we can go to the next field. Unfortunately, for Visual Studio Code, which I don't like, right? A lot of times, what happens is we want to find it in selection, and if you don't click on this, then it'll find it everywhere. So we want to find an equal sign, and when we want to replace with a colon, right? And even more so, not just an equal sign, but I've coded this with a space equals. Let's use that space equals. So I want to replace the space equals with a colon, okay? And then just, click replace all, which is this little button right here. So that kind of converts that right for me, right? And the next thing that I want to do, right, it says JSON object, right? So we have this extra, little part right here we don't need because it kind of did that too. This is the danger of find replace. we also want to replace all these semicolons with a comma. Let's do that. So we'll say, look inside this object, look for semicolons. There they are, right? And replace a semicolon with a comma. We're going to fix some of the other ones. I'm going to place a semicolon with comma, all right? And I can do one at a time this time. So I want to replace the first one, the second one, the third one, you know, as an example. Replace all these, right? This is what I want to do. And then the bottom one I won't replace. Okay, so this is kind of where I want to go with that. Okay, so that's kind of the first part, right? And then the next part is where I have these objects for JSON data. Okay, I'm going to get out of here. For JSON data, because I'm basically creating a JSON object. So it's like this, right? Once I start this off, you can see that here I'm creating the properties one at a time, right? So you can see that first name is equal to first name, last name, and so on. But I want to use the keyword this in here. So I want to say that I want to take this dot last name, this dot first name. It's the other way around, right? And so I'm getting the data from the class itself. I'm saying, hey, go to the class, whatever's inside of first name, last name, email address, contact number, and short message, and JSONify it. Make a new JSON object and pass all this stuff inside there. So that right there is basically JSON data now. It's been converted into a JSON object. And to prove this, right, because I mean one thing is we can make it to string. The other one we convert is to JSON. Let's spell this properly. So to JSON. Hopefully we'll have this all working in a second. Okay, so to string, to JSON, yay. And then let's use it. So if I go back to our app.js, and here's to string, let's convert this to JSON. So if I say console log, and then if I say contact.toJSON, right? And now I don't get code hinting, and we're going to fix that later on. But contact.toJSON, what this is going to do is it's going to output a JSON object, okay? And once I've done a JSON object, guys, I can serialize it, send it to a database. I can, you know, compare it, do something with it, whatever I want to do, and it'll be I can convert it, convertible from my contact type to a JSON type. Let's see what that looks like when I run it. So again, control backtick. I'm going to run this in light server, right? That took a second to turn on. And here I am with this, and let's take a look at what it looks like in the console, right? All right, I don't care about that. Let us go to our contact page, right? And we're starting to, there's no data yet. We have to give data. So again, Tom Smythe, sure, why not? And contact number, email address is, you can't see it, I'm just typing in the background. Don't worry, it's example.com. And a message that says hi, okay? Or not H1, hi, all right? And I want to send, right? So once I click the send button, everything goes well, and then it says JSON object is not defined, okay? So we got this information, but why not this JSON object? Well, because inside of our class in that contact, we can't just do this. We have to use the let keyword, all right? So this is a local variable, JSON object. JSON object is basically, if you hover over it now, it creates an object of first name, last name, email address, contact number, and short message, mirroring what we have in our contact properties, right? And when I do this, and I go back to this, let's do it one more time. Now it's going to work, right? So again, so Tom Smythe, I don't know why I used that, St. John Smythe, 416-555-5555, and then, you know, Tom at example.com, and we're going to say hello this time. Why not? So then go down here and click send, and now we can see that we have an object, which is of prototype objects. We've actually converted our type to a JSON object, and this is awesome. Because guys, like I said, once it's JSON, JSON is kind of a way of us transferring data from one place to another. Now, we don't normally need to do this because, you know what? If I'm writing an API, I'm going to make it accept contact. But sometimes it's really important to have this as a utility function. Could I use an object and convert it into JSON by using JSON.JSONify equivalent, like the one that we talked about here inside of this JSON.parse, right? Yes, I could do this. But this is using JSON's built-in method, and it's kind of random in terms of what it's going to do. The great thing about using it this string, is you can also, this square brackets means optional. You can also use an optional callback function that once it's been converted, you can kind of output something saying it's been converted. Yay, right? And we're going to see this as we get into Ajax. So that is converting between strings and JSONs and JSON objects, and I did that without actually doing this. So here's an example of a string. So the string looks like this, right? And then I want to take this string and convert it into a JSON object, and I just use JSON.parse. I pass in this object into the string and converts it. So this is the way to do it that's built in. For us, though, because we're making our custom object, this doesn't make any sense. Why would I convert it to string and then use JSON.parse to convert it back into a JSON object? I'd rather go directly into a JSON object with what we're doing. And that's why I did it the way we did it. Okay. Yes, it is kind of like swapping, right? So I want to make, I'm not sure if Nushik, if that was your comment on this, but that's what I'm doing. So I'm swapping from a contact to the other thing. Okay, now what I'm doing is I'm going to move on. So yay, we did all this stuff. We've talked about objects and so on, and this is great. You guys have practiced doing some validation with forms, and there's no place to send this information right now, right? Because this information is going to be sent to a database eventually, so we can process this form. Right now, it's just sending it to the console, okay? So nothing that's too crazy. But what I want to do is I want to move on from this, because now that we have this as a piece of JSON data, I can read stuff into my contact by getting it from JSON. So I can take from JSON, pass in an object that is JSON file, and then strip it out and make it into pieces of my contact. Okay, so I can do it the other way around, and we're going to do that next. So I'm going to go to the second PowerPoint. Now this PowerPoint, disclaimer, this is supposed to be something we hit week 10. And I know I'm doing things out of order, and I do apologize, guys, but I'm an out of order kind of guy. I don't know. What can I tell you? I think that talking about JSON and string manipulation, regular expressions, and all that kind of stuff, there's a great segue between that topic and this topic. I think there's more synergy in doing it this way, right? As opposed to talking about, I believe, things like security and some other topic that we have next week, which I'll still cover. It's just going to be next week as opposed to something that I'd want to add on this week. So again, what we want to do is, we've been doing a lot of duplication too. And one of the things that I want to avoid is some of the stuff that we've been doing here. So we've been doing things like, hey, look, I've got an about page, and my about page, guess what? It's loading all of this data from my nav bar. And so is my contact page, so is my index page, so is my product page. All these pages have the same exact nav bar. Wouldn't it be nice, just like in PHP, that I could load up this data, this nav bar, and only have one nav bar in a separate file, a partial file, that I can manipulate one place, and all of my HTML files will use that partial file? That would be nice, wouldn't it? Right? And it'd be really nice if I can inject my data about contact, index, and products and services. I can inject it by having these content pages. So I have content pages, and then I'll have these partial pages. The partial pages will be almost like partial constructs. There won't be complete HTML pages. This is my thought, okay? I'm just talking about it here like a conversation, right? I have a header as an example, and this header, and there's a main part, right, into all of my index, all my pages, right? My footer, and then there's this JavaScript stuff, right? Which, if you think about it, I can probably partition as a region as well. and I can load all this stuff in separately. So, but these three things are definitely things that keep repeating, right? There's a lot of repetition among these three pieces. And it would be really nice if I don't necessarily have to load or rejig every single time. I want to make another nav bar. I want to do another main, another footer. The footer is exactly the same. The nav bar is actually exactly the same. The only thing that really changes is this, right? And which is not, there's not a lot of content right now. So that would be awesome if I could do that. And loading and saving files, the only way you can load stuff, right, is through Ajax. The only way you can save stuff, you can't really do it through Ajax. You need to use some kind of server. So you have to use either some kind of Node.js server, like I said, or a PHP server on the back end or something, right? So we can't save anything, but we can definitely load things, which is what I want to do today. And we want to load it in. There's three things we can load. We can load HTML pages. We can load plain text, right? And we can load JSON data, well, or XML. But again, XML has fallen out of favor over the last several years because of its wordiness and syntax, heavy syntax that we have to kind of parse, right? Whereas with JSON, it becomes an object. And once it's an object, I can just pass it into my other objects that I've created, my other classes, which just is awesome from a data transferring perspective. I can just load data in, right? And I have data, right? So that's what we're going to do today. At least for the second half. We may not be able to complete all of this because this is like a lesson of its own, but I want to start you on the right path. All right, so let's get to it. So again, it talks about this Ajax. What is Ajax? And it used to be called XML, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's what it used to stand for. But guys, I don't want you to call it asynchronous JavaScript and XML because the XML part isn't really true anymore, right? It's really just called Ajax these days. It's just a format, a way. Think about it as a messaging protocol where we can connect to our data and then load data. That's what we want to do. Or somehow manipulate data through Ajax. Ajax is actually the core foundation for most front-end frameworks like Angular, React, Vue, and a bunch of other front-end frameworks that you'll be hearing about in COMP125 next semester. Okay, so that's what Ajax is. So we don't want to call it asynchronous, JavaScript and XML. It is asynchronous, and the JavaScript is true, but the XML is wrong. So one thing we'll be using is something called an XML HTTP request object. Unfortunately, the XML part remains, right? This XML part. And what I'm going to kind of convert this into when we talk about this is an XHR object. HTTP request is what it is, but it's an XML HTTP request, which is really a request for data. In your mind, whenever you think of XML HTTP requests, it's, hey, data. I need data from my server. That's what I need. And that's how it kind of works, okay? Places that use XML HTTP requests or XHR objects, they used to be called dynamic HTML, no longer, right? That used to be the way we used to call them, or DHTML. Google, whenever you do a Google search, what happens is, as you type, it's basically raising an event. So as you're typing, keywords in the Google search bar, it's searching for for data that's in the database and kind of comparing and saying, are you looking for this? Are you looking for this? Are you looking for this? As you type, real time, right? And all this is doing is just searching a database, a massive database, where they have information about different topics. That's how, in essence, that's how the Google search engine was founded, through Ajax, right? And also, the way it works is this. I have a client. I make a client request to the server. The server processes that request and then returns with a response back to the client. Okay, so this idea of sending a request, getting a response, I get a request object and I get a response object back. That's what I got. So it processes something and then it comes back with a response, right? That's how it works with the server. Request response. And this full circle, right, or round trip, as we like to call it, right, is what happens over and over again for some languages. I make a round trip. I kind of go out to the server, it processes something, and it comes back. And the more I do this, the slower my website is. Okay, the more I do a round trip, because I got to go to the server, and sometimes it takes several milliseconds. Now it used to take several seconds, right? That's no longer acceptable. Seconds for me to access a server is like we're in the Stone Ages, kind of thing. We're not in the Stone Age. We're in the modern age, with other bad things, but human malware. But really, at the end of the day, we send a request out to the, and get a response back in milliseconds, right? Compared to what it was before. So again, this idea of Google, we put in the keyword solar in google.com. It processes this and returns several options: solar movie, solar city, solar system, all this kind of stuff. It kind of returns back, and it returns it inside of that text box. That's what it does. So it does it automatically, right? Or it seems to be automatic, but really what's happening is it's doing this round trip. Every time you type a single digit or a character in the Google search engine, the search bar, or any search bar for that matter, it goes out to the server, does some processing, and comes back. Okay, round trip. So this idea, and by the way, another place to where Ajax was used a lot is Google Maps, right? I move my map around, and as I'm looking, whatever I'm looking physically on the screen, it pulls that texture, that image, from a database and replaces what I have on my screen with whatever I'm actually looking at. So it's kind of interesting the way it works. It fools us into thinking there's interaction, but really what's happening is it's using Ajax. It's going out to the server, doing a round trip, and coming back with a response. There's no formal request from us, but as soon as I'm manipulating anything that I'm seeing on my screen, then what's really happening is I'm sending signals. I'm sending messages to the server. I'm saying, hey, move this zone here around. When I say move the zone, what it's really saying is replace my images that I'm seeing with some other images to make it feel like I'm moving my map around. I'm not really moving my map around. I'm just pulling more information from the server. That's what I'm doing. And I'm replacing the current information in a certain region. Notice that whenever you go on, if I go to Google Maps, right, so let's try Maps for a second to see this. Now it's improved a hell of a lot. Okay, it didn't used to be like this before. But if I go to Google Maps now, and if I kind of do one of these, you might be thinking that I've got this massive map, a massive map that's really huge, right? But actually, that's not true. What's happening is these little regions that I'm just filling up with map data, and it's happening so fast, off screen, by the way, off screen, so it looks like everything on screen is contiguous. But actually, off screen, I'm doing the replacement. That's what I'm happening. I'm actually, whenever I do this, if I pull something on the map, what's happening is I'm reloading pieces of the map offline, right? And moving the piece of the map that I can see online in a different location, right? It's quite ingenious, actually, the way it works. And same thing if I zoom out. If I zoom out, look what's happening. I'm zooming out, and then what's happening is, in real time, without you noticing, I'm replacing the level of detail with map data that I'm seeing, until there's going to be a point in time when, if I go fast enough, see that? You see that those little squares? That's exactly what's happening. As I move forward, it's the same thing that happens, right? Where I move forward or move back out, right? So Ajax is being used for map data as well. I don't know why I'm centered on Detroit right now, but it just is what it is. So that's Ajax in a nutshell. That's how it works. That's the idea behind it at a very high level. We can also talk about web services. A lot of these modern web applications nowadays, instead of having a monolithic application, we can break things down to smaller components called web services. For example, I want to log in to a service. I could have my login screen coupled tightly with my web application, or I can have a separate web service that I go to, that I connect to, that does my login for me, right? And then it sends a signal back to my other web service that says, yes, Tom has logged in, right? As opposed to having one big monolithic application that does everything, right? Advantages to that, if I have a web service, I can really work on the web service component separately, as an example, and I can manipulate it, make it better, and where I leave the other parts of my application alone. Same, kind of thing. The advantages are I can have different people working on different parts of my application, and one part of my application doesn't really impact necessarily the other parts of my application. I can change my UI. on my web service over here, let's say for my login or for some kind of data access or whatever, and it's not going to affect my UI for my other parts. Disadvantage, it's more complex to work with web services, right? Why? Because now I have all these loosely coupled objects all over the place, and I need to kind of somehow, have some kind of coherence as one big, to the user, it should appear as if it's one big web application, but it's not. And so I have to do things like, intricate messaging and so on. And security is also an issue. But one thing that I have to help me with it is some kind of API key or some kind of security that I use to kind of pass from one web service to another. And that API key, guys, a lot of times it accesses JSON data. And instead of me responding back, how do one web service talk to another web service? JSON. It talks in JSON behind the scenes. You don't see it, but it's actually what's happening. So JSON gets sent as an object from one web service to the other, and once that web service accepts the JSON object, it can say, do I have the right information, whether it's an API key or data or whatever that's been encrypted or encoded, and then great, I have the information I need, good, send back the response in again JSON data saying we're all good to go, I'm here, here's your data that you're asking for. So that's what's happening here. So web services are what's come to pass because of JSON. PHP is on the downturn. I know it says proxy scripts are often written in PHP. PHP, it's an older language on the back end. There's some good advancements that's been happening with PHP lately. And there's still, I would say, 75 to 80% penetration from a back end with PHP. PHP is a back end server language to process requests, right? So I send a request just like we did up here, right? So we send a request to the server, a PHP server. PHP processes the request and returns the response. But the more modern way of returning responses, instead of PHP, because this is one way of doing it, is some kind of web server, and it could be, again, the three popular ones that are out there as a backend. When we talk about solution stacks, let me talk about this language here with you. Is again the most popular is the Apache HTTP server, right? The new one that is something that people have been talking about a lot lately is Nginx. All right, which is a much quicker way, a more flexible server on the back end. It supports Node.js, modern technologies, and other kinds of languages. As only with Apache, PHP is mostly supported. Okay, and then of course Microsoft Information Services as a server on the back end, Microsoft Server, it supports .NET languages for the most part. All right, so .NET Core and that kind of stuff. So there's different solution stacks is what they're called, okay? And the most common solution stack right now is Apache, MySQL, and PHP, or what we like to call AMP, the AMP stack, okay? That's what it's called. And for Nginx, the common solution stack is something like Nginx, which supports Node, right? And then Node uses Express middleware, and Express middleware it supports things like MongoDB, so it's the NoSQL database, right? And then on the front end, you have something like an Angular or a React. Okay, so that is another stack. And if we reorder these letters, we get something called the mean stack: Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node on the back end. A very popular stack that's used by outfits like Amazon and Walmart and a bunch of other people that realize that using JavaScript everywhere is the way to go. That's why I told you JavaScript is like kind of a hard to learn, hard to master language. But the great thing about JavaScript is it's now the language that powers the web. Microsoft has its solution stack, but it's usually .NET Core is what it's called. And it usually has some kind of IIS in the back end, Internet Information Services equivalent, or a Microsoft server. And then .NET Core is the language that it uses on the back end, with C# as the language, so C#. And then as on the front end, you can use whatever you want: Angular, React, whatever, or Razor, which is something that Blazor that C# is having lately from Microsoft. All right, so there's different solution stacks. That's what they're called. And they all support different ways of doing these round trips. Okay, so again, go out to the server, get it with a request, return from the server with a response. Okay? So one of the things we have to do when it comes to using Ajax, there's 4 steps. We instantiate an XHR object. That's the first thing we do. So we instantiate this new object. The object is going to hold our request or hold our response. That's what the XHR object is going to do. Okay? And then we're going to use the XHR object to send a request to the server. We're going to receive a response from the server saying, I'm ready. Here's my requested data. And then we're going to process the data and return from the server back into JSON, using JSON data to respond back to the client. That's how it works. So 4 steps, more or less. And it looks like this. Instantiate an XHR object, send it to the server. The server returns data in terms of JSON data, and then when we convert JSON data back into a string or do whatever you want with it. Okay, that's what happens. And there's more details here about how this works. So here, there's 2 parts of the server, and you might say there's different services, right? So we have a client that sends a request out to the Apache server. The Apache server connects to the web service, which is run by PHP. PHP processes the language processes the request, responds with a response to the server. The server, from at that point responds back with some data, right? This is the PHP side. By the way, it works exactly kind of the same when it comes to Node.js on the way back as well, somewhat similarly. But notice what happens is there's something called a proxy request that goes from the server to the web service, and from the web service there's a service response that comes back to the web server and then back out to the client. So this round trip idea again. So these 2 things, request, response, huge. Okay, we need to know what those things are. If I say request to you, in your mind you should think about a request object, a container that holds data. Okay, I'm sending data out to a message, if you will, to the server. The server is going to take this message, process it, and in time, and asynchronously, by the way, respond. Which means you cannot depend on when the server is going to respond back to you. It could respond back in 2 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds. You don't know. That means if I send multiple requests out to a server, I might get some request objects back earlier than the other ones that I sent earlier. Right? It really depends on the server, because the server is going to prioritize the responses according to what's best for the server, how it's been allocated and configured. Okay, so that's something to understand too. Okay, that you're going to get things back asynchronously, which means not in the order that you potentially sent it in. If I send it in the order to the server, I send my first request, my second request, and my third request. I may get them back in second request, third request, and first request, or I might get it back first request, second request, third request. It could be whatever the order is from the server, and that poses a bit of a debugging question, because we're expecting things to come back in a specific order, but actually they come back in a really messed up order, right? And so we have to keep that in mind when we're working with JSON data and Ajax. We know what HTTP is, and we have to know the difference between an HTTP client and an HTTP server. Server is a web server. Usually it's housed in something like a Linux box. You guys are taking Linux as well. Hopefully your professor, whoever you're dealing with, is showing you how to create a little server on the Linux side. I know I have done a little bit with with my people that are in my Linux class at the same time they're in this class, right? I'm just looking some of the comments and questions here. So you don't need any sort of backend to use Ajax. Nope, you don't need a backend to use Ajax necessarily. Well, you do, but we're going to simulate the backend as it doesn't matter what backend you use, because what's going to happen right now is we're going to read from our Apache server equivalent or a Node.js server. I don't have to have another language like PHP on the backend to send me back a response. As long as the file exists, physical file exists with on our server somewhere, I can read it. Now, accessing a database like MongoDB, again, I can use Ajax for this, but I need a server for that. Okay, so do I need a server for a backend to read a file? No, but I do need the Apache piece, the actual web service itself to run. and it says, so we use .NET Framework instead of .NET Core. .NET Framework is, the .NET Framework is .NET Core. It's just, .NET Core is a web version, if you will, or webified version of .NET. That's what it is. Using C# instead of JavaScript. So what happens is you write things in JavaScript, it converts it you write things in C#, it converts it to JavaScript, and it creates your pages kind of dynamically, right? So you don't really have, index.html pages. You have other kind of pages, and a lot of stuff written in C#, and then it converts it to HTML and JavaScript, something that's compatible with a web browser. Okay, that's how .NET Core works, and actually it works the same way in some ways as PHP, because PHP does the same thing. It takes your stuff and converts it into JavaScript and HTML and CSS, and it creates it composes the page for you, as opposed to just reading a straight page. So once we start getting into this back-end technology stuff, it's where back in the day we started getting this better interactivity, better responsiveness, if you will. Responsive design or adaptive design. We also have to know what a host is. So the host is, I have my client, which is my client. I'm accessing the host. The host system is usually another server or a system that's basically hosting the service. Okay. Different web versions. So it says here version 2, HTTP version 2 was in development at the time of this writing, when this thing was written, but now we're far past this. All right, so we're into version 3 and version 4. Okay, and we're going to be talking about HTTP messages. We're setting out an HTTP message and getting back a response. Okay, that's what's happening. Okay, so here they're just talking about, this is just like naming, understanding about naming conventions. What do all these things mean? Right? We have things like headers, and the headers are the things that make up a message. There's the header of the message, and there's the body of the message. And a lot of times what we want to do is want to fix up the headers so that when they're received by the server, they mean something, right? A lot of times, if you send a message that doesn't have the proper headers, then it messes up the protocol and you get a really weird response. Now, the great thing about this is that Ajax sends off some default headers that allow you to have a decent response without thinking about the headers too much. You could specify a header, a type of header for the message body, but you don't need to do that for the most part. I'm going to skip by this because it's a lot of stuff. I want to get to the coding part, but I need to explain some of this so that you understand what it means. The most common HTTP requests are get and post, and you should have seen this already when you did HTML 101 with whoever you did your first Web Fundamentals class with. I know a lot of times Joanne Filati does that too, so she's one of the professors that do that. When you get a GET request, GET and POST seem to be blurred when it comes to making requests to the server. You don't know which one, what the difference is between GET and POST. And I'm just going to ask that question now, just to keep you guys on top. Don't ask me what HTTP is, hypertext protocol. Let me go back to this. How about this? Here's a better question, Harris. What is the difference between GET and POST? What is the difference between GET and POST? Why would I rather do GET over POST or POST over GET? Why would I bother with this? Does anyone know? If you know, put it in chat. What do you think the difference is between? And try not to look it up. See if you can remember, because looking it up, that's just like Googling it, right? They're directional. Okay. Someone says no idea. Harris says no idea. Okay, they are. They can be, but we can have both forms that use GET methods and POST methods, right? Here's the difference for me. When I start learning about GET and POST, I'm talking about from a HTML perspective or HTTP perspective. GET, what it does is it shows your request on the URL. All right, so on the address bar up here, right, it will show your request if I make a GET request. POST won't show anything up here, okay? More secure than GET. However, if you want to have the user make the exact same request by copying a link, get is the way to go. If you're going to have the user log into a service, post is the way you want to go in general. Okay. Now, the way it's handled from a Node.js perspective or something else, these words mean two different things. Get usually means I want to get or display something like a website. Post means I want to process my data that I send to the server and get a response back. That's what it can mean as well. And there's different other request methods like delete, put, and update. There's other ones that we can use as well. Okay. So different kinds of methods. So again, it kind of goes into more detail here. Used for standard web requests. So I want to make a GET request. A GET request means I want to get give me the data for the page. Show me the page. That's the GET request. Post, similar to GET, but a lot of times we don't see the request on the URL. We don't see it. Okay, and a lot of times we use a post request for data processing. We want to process a form. I use a post. If I want to get the entire web, the page, I use a GET. Okay, and we'll talk about this later on. And this happens in the background. So there's different kinds of parts of an HTTP request. There's the host. There's the user agent. The user agent is basically when we make a request, the user agent would be the browser. Okay, that's a good example of a user agent. And each browser has something called a user agent string that can tell us which browser is the thing that's accessing your website. A lot of times, if we know the user agent string, then I can adapt my responses for my website to that particular browser. Okay, what I mean by that is, if I know that a mobile browser is accessing my website because of its user agent string, it tells me it's like Safari from iOS, then why would I respond back with a regular desktop website? In fact, what I want to do is I'm going to use the user agent string as well as my viewport size to say, wait, I've got a mobile device that's requesting a page. Guess what? I'm going to change the size of my response so that the viewport that I send back fits a mobile page as it comes back, right? Just based on the user agent string and the viewport size. Viewport size meaning how big my screen is from an X and Y coordinate perspective, an addressable space perspective. Is it 1024 by 768? That's a pretty big phone. Or is it something else, right? So, and there's other things here that I'm just gonna gloss over these because I want to get to it. Otherwise, we're gonna spend more time doing this. Okay. So what we need is there's going to be some status codes. Whenever we send a request, we get a response code back, a status code back, saying information has been received. Okay. Once I get the request received, right? So a 100 type request, right? Then that means that the server received the request. When the request is successful, if I've made a successful request, like I've coded it properly, the proper headers, all that kind of stuff, I'm going to get a 200 back. I want a 200, okay? And a lot of times we might get a 304, right, kind of response back, which means, guess what? There's nothing for me to do, right, kind of stuff, or 302 actually. And then I could also get a 404 type response. So requests can't be fulfilled for some reason. Like for example, I can't find the website, 404, site not found, as an example. So these are the response codes we're going to get back when we make a request. All right, and we see these requests right now. There's also a 5XX kind of response, which means like server error. The server stopped working. That can also be something you get back. And it talks about that right here. So 200 is okay. 304 is we responded, like not modified. For example, you're going to get a 304 request a lot when I run this. Take a look here. If I'm running my little light server, I'm getting 304s back. 304, it's making a GET request, right? I'm trying to get my information, and notice it says I'm getting a 200. 200 back means everything is good. I kind of receive your request. It was successfully processed. That's the GET request type. And then 304 means you've been trying to access this bootstrap.min.css map, and nothing's changed with this thing. So I'm not returning anything back to you. There's nothing for me to do. You already have this in your cache. You know, you want to get the logo, but you already have this loaded in your browser. So I'm not going to respond with a new logo. I'm not going to get you to download this again. You've already got it in your website or in your cache, right? And the same thing goes with this one, bootstrap.min.js map. Well, guess what? You already have this map. I don't need to respond with anything. So I'm going to give you back a 304 saying, I don't need to do anything. Thank you for that response, but you have everything you need. That's what these 304s mean, okay? So, you know, 404 is like I'm trying to find something that doesn't exist. So for me to generate a 404 would mean for me to go to my website, like up here, and then, I don't know, try and get to a page that I can't get to. So, I don't know, go to blah.html, right? Blah.html says cannot get blah.html, right? And if I go back, it gives me a 404 type error. 404, there is no blah.html, it doesn't exist, right? So that's how that works. And 404 is probably one of the most common errors. We want to make custom 404 pages for our websites because this is really ugly, right? We want to give our customers saying things, oops, you went to the wrong site. Are you sure you want to be here? You know, which a lot of sites now do. Okay, so custom 404 pages. Remember, what is happening with when I'm running a light server is it's running a little mini Node.js server on the back end. That's what it's doing, a little server that's on your system that's simulating what it's like to be on a real web server. That's what's happening. Okay, so these are legit responses back from that little server that we're running in the back end. Okay, so different kinds of server responses that we're looking for. So I'm going to skip this one. Again, some of this information, the location is really, really important. We can use the location object to redirect our client to a different URI, a different website. We can do that. We can use the server object, which returns information about the server. These are all objects that come in from the header. Okay, and there's something that comes in that we can track with our window object. Remember, we talked about the BOM, the browser object model, earlier on this semester. Well, the BOM also has other things other than just the window, right? So the key to all this is this XHR object. The XHR object is the thing that we want to create and exchange with the server, right? And there's some stuff we can do with the XHR object. One of them is open up the URL. We're going to see this xhr.open. And we're going to say, okay, what's the method, get or post? What's the URL? And do I want to send things over synchronously or asynchronously? And by the way, the square brackets mean optional. I can specify if it's synchronous or asynchronous, which, by the way, synchronous is deprecated. We don't usually use synchronous for anything anymore. And we can also optionally send over user and password information, because if I'm going to connect to some kind of object online, I want to sometimes do it securely. All right, so that's what the open does. Open opens up a channel, if you will, to the server. Send actually executes my request. So my request is not really executed until I do the send request. That's what I'm doing. Okay, I want you to think of it that way. And then I'm going to get a response, and I've got to close down my my connection. All right. I'm going to get a couple of events happening. One is a ready state event. Okay, the ready state event is I'm going to get different kinds of ready states. One is 0, uninitialized, 1, open, 2, sent, 3, receiving, and 4, loaded. What I want for me to be perfect is for my ready state, when I get a response back, to be a 4. Ready state of 4. Okay, and I want my status code to be 200. Okay, that's what I want. So ready state of 4 and a status of 200. If I have those two things, I know that I've communicated properly with the server, and I'm good to go. I'm going to get two types of objects back. One, a response text object. I'm going to get a string back. Remember, we just talked about stringifying and JSONifying it, parsing it. I'm going to respond. I'm going to get my string back, and I can convert this string, this response text, to whatever I want. I can get my response text and I can change it into JSON, or I can keep it as a string. Okay? So that's what I'm going to get back. This is the object I'm getting back, and I'm getting back the object as a string. That's what I'm getting a string of characters, if you will. Okay? So here's the process. We're going to make a new XML HTTP request, XHR object, right? A lot of times what we want to use is this try-catch statement for exception handling in order for us to make sure that when we send off an XHR object, that it's not going to break something, all right? Because if it breaks, then our website will stop working, okay? We don't want that to happen ever. Same thing with your application in C# or C++ or Java. You want to use a try-catch to potentially catch an exception as opposed to have an unhandled exception, which will break your code. On the downside, negative use of a try-catch can be used as well to catch any kind of error and ignore errors. We don't want that to happen. Okay. So here's an example of the beginnings of making our request object. First, in this case, what they've defined here in the book is this function that's getRequestObject. What they do is they're making a new XHR objects, XML HTTP request, and then they're trying to return it. Back in the day, not all browsers supported a XHR object. Nowadays, though, it does. Most browsers, I would say 99% of browsers out there, support. And remember how it works. If we go up to our website and I go to can I use, right? Can I use? And if I say XML HTTP request, right? So if I type that in, XML HTTP request, see this XML HTTP request API? 95.37% of browsers globally support this now. So we don't have to worry about this anymore. Okay? So this XML HTTP request API, we're good to go. Okay? And same thing with this XML HTTP request open. These two things, like we're talking about, like more than 95% of browsers support this kind of thing. So we don't have to worry about it anymore as much as we used to. Back in the day, though, not all browsers supported XHR objects. So this is why in the book it's showing us to do this try-catch stuff, right? To say, hey, does our browser support this object? Now, some of you might say, well, what if we want to support older browsers? And my answer to you is, which ones? IE3? No one runs that anymore, right? Or some other older browser, as an example. I mean, all browsers, even the ones on phones, support XHR objects now, pretty much. So 95%. So for that 5%, for me to write this extra code and to house this as safety, it's nice, but not required for the most part. So our Ajax call, I'm just going to skip through this. Our Ajax call is going to be, we're going to use this XHR object. That's the first thing. And we need to kind of read some data. So first we need some data to read, right? And we're going to have our address book, right? Think about this, name, email, address book that I want to read, right? So let's suppose I want to create something like this, and this is where our coding starts. I want to make a JSON object that I want to read that has data. Okay, so let's suppose our data is somewhere in here. I'm going to make a new JSON object. Do this with me. And remember, we're going to call this, I don't know, we'll call it address book too, because we have context in an address book. So here's addressbook.json. Okay. Whenever we format a JSON file locally, like something like this, we want to encode it, first of all, with curly braces. So curly braces are the first thing we want to put in. The curly braces basically say, hey, this is the object, right? That's the first thing we want to do. Just this alone basically says we're getting an object back, okay? Just like it shows here. Now, this is where the JSON object changes a little bit, right? If I want address book to be an array of contexts, which is what we're going to do today, right? We're going to set this up. So we'll say address book. Again, I would recommend making it the way you want it, which is I'm going to code address book in camel case, address book. You can certainly do it like they say here in the book, like this. That's fine. But the first thing I'd like to do is even whether they say it or not, is address book. The next thing is we know that address books is going to be an array. So I want to use kind of this array, these array square brackets, just like I use curly braces for my, my object. This is my object. Now I'm making an address book. It's called address book, right? And here's my array. Okay. Inside of my array, I want a contact. I don't have to name it, but it has to be in the format that I want. In my case, my contacts look first name, last name, and so on. Remember? Like this, my contact. This is what I want it to look like. Okay? So it behooves me to kind of structure my my JSON object just like this, right? So let's do it. So let's grab all this. We're going to redo it. We're going to go back to our address book and plop it in. We can't have it like this in a JSON file, which is different than JSON data inside of our code. Notice that we have to have things in quotations. All right, so it likes this. It doesn't like this. It doesn't like properties. It likes it like everything encapsulated in quotes. So for example, if I want my first name, to be here, this is actual data now we're talking about, right? So this would be Tom. Okay, so, and notice that we have a colon separating the data. Don't worry about this yet. Okay, so then we're going to go to the next step. So again, it's last name, as an example, colon, and then whatever the last name is going to be, Smythe. Now, bear with me while we do this. We set this up together. All right, so Smythe, right? And if you notice that we have colons here and everything is in quotations. I've got quotations on the first name. I've got quotations on the last name. And I want to encapsulate this as an object of its own, because these, my friends, are objects. So these objects here, this first object is going to be inside. It's going to be an array of these kind of objects that we want to have, right? So I'm just formulating this with you right now, okay? So here's my array of objects, first name, last name. I'm going to keep doing it. So do it with me as I go. So this is my email address. Here's my contact number. We're going to do this one time, and then I'm going to copy paste. All right? And then here's my short message. Yay, right? And I want to say that my email address, what is that? We know I've been using something like tom@example.com. And you know what? My contact number is 416-555-5555. Sure. And my short message is hello. Hello world. Sure. Okay. Now that I've done this, I've created a contact. That is a contact that's inside my address book array. Okay, here's my address book array. Here is my contact. Okay, I can have multiple contacts inside of my address book as data. So I can put a comma and then include another contact. Let's do another one. So let's make Peter Parker. Instead of Tom last name, by the way, it should be like Smythe. How about that? Peter Parker. Right? I like that one. And Peter is going to be Peter@example.com. And his contact number is going to end with a 6. And, he might say something like, with great power, right? I'm not going to finish that off. You can finish that off. You should know what that is by now if you're a fan. And if you're not, woe is you. All right? So then, we've got this. We've got first name, last name. Let's do another one. We'll do all the superheroes, right? We'll do Tony Stark. So Anthony Stark, right? And we'll say Tony@example.com. And he's going to say, hey Jarvis, can you, whatever he's going to say, right? So that's Peter Parker, Tony Stark, it's me. I'm a superhero too, sure. And why not? And you know what? I like Doctor Strange, so he's my favorite. To be honest with you, when I was a kid, Doctor Strange was like, he's the most powerful guy ever. I mean, really, if you think about this. So Stephen Strange, right? And we'll say Strange@example.com. He'll be 558. There we go. And then we'll say by the hoary hosts of Hoggoth. Okay, that's what he does a lot, hoary host of Hoggoth and all this other stuff. Okay, so we got a few contacts here, I'm going to read them. We want to read these contacts in, into the thing. So here's my address book. I'm going to put this up on GitHub so you have access to this exact data, so you and I can have the same thing. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to put this up on GitHub, right? Because I've made some stuff. I'll say added address book.json. And then if you go to GitHub, you should be able to pull that that information now, or just copy paste from GitHub, whatever you want. Sure, I should have said that. I'm Iron Man. That's terrible. I didn't even think of that. I'm Iron Man. Yes, Tiago, you're the best. All right, thank you. All right, so yeah, so we've got this, and we've got the address book.json. I want to read this address book, right? That's what I want to do. So we have to begin with our protocol in order for me to read my address book. So going back to this is the first thing. We need some data to read. Then we're going to send a request to the server, and we're looking for a ready state, like I said. So I'm just going to skip down here so we can get to it. First, we make an XHR HTTP object. Okay, so I'm going to do that in my code. So I'm going to go into my app.js, right, as an example, and we're going to put this, we're going to check to see here, right, this page here, validate form, function validate form, is only going to be used. Remember how we did this? So here is our highlight active link. This one is add paragraph to Jumbotron. This is going to be validate form, and it says that let title be highlight active link, and success is add paragraphs to Jumbotron. Awesome. And we're going to say let form validated equals to validate form, and it's going to check to see if my form exists before I do this, right? Well, yes, sure, we can do this kind of stuff, but I want to check to see what the title is, right? Remember what the title would be? I can check the title string, and depending on the title string, right, what I want is if the title is my products page, or we'll call it the products page, right? In my products page, I want to include my superheroes. I'm selling my superheroes as a product. Yay, right? And I want to load them up. So only if I'm on my products page. So in order for me to do that, I need to check to see if I'm on that page in the start function. So let's say if title is equal to start products, then, and again, you can have a switch case here if you want, but let's just do a console.log. We're on the products page. So just to make sure that only on the products page, this is where it's going to happen. Okay? And if I go back to my browser for a second, and if I go to the products page, then we should say we're on the products page. If I go to another page like services, no. Okay? And different ways of doing this. We can use switch case or whatever. So I'm on the products page. Yeah. Now that I'm on the products page, this is where I want to do all that funky work. I want to load my data, right? I want to load my data, right? So instead of doing this, I've confirmed that I got to be on products in order for me to do something. I want to load address book data. We'll call it that. Load address book data. Okay? That's what the function is going to be called. We don't have this function yet, but we're going to do it. We're going to make it. So up at the top, just similar to what we did with highlight active link and add paragraphs to Jumbotron and validate form, we're going to have another function called load address book data, right? And inside of my load address book data is where I'm going to do this new XHR object. So I'm going to say let XHR equal to XML HTTP request. And it's got to be a new XHR object, new. Okay? What this does is it creates an object that's a container, right? That's what this does. And XHR is going to hold the XML HTTP request object. Okay? So that's the first step. So this is step one. Okay? Create a new object. Step two. Let's go back to the PowerPoint for a second. So this is the first step. We've done this part, and now we're going to open the request. We're going to make a GET request, and we're going to GET request this object. Now, right now, it's not in a data folder. It's just outside somewhere else. We're not going to even put true. We're just going to say request.open. So the request is the XHR. So we're going to say that step 2. We're going to say XHR.open, right? And I'm just going to hide this part so we don't have to see this all the time. And in the XHR open requests, we're going to say that the method, which is going to be a GET request, right? The URL string, which is in our case the file that we're going to load. We're going to load addressbook.json, okay? And that is the request for now. Okay, we're not putting addressbook.json inside of a folder yet. We will. One step at a time. So that's the second step. All right, first step is, hey, we open it, or we make it, we open it. And now, after we do that, what we want to do when we get the object from a file, I'm just going to skip over this. It talks about synchronous and asynchronous like we talked about before. We want to make this send request, right? But we don't want to make the send request too early, all right? So again, we're going to open it. We're going to make a send request. And the send request can have 2 parts. It can have some data that we send to the server that the server is going to interpret and modify our request with a different response. Or we can send nothing. So example, we could do something like this. Step 3, xhr.send, right? And we don't have to send anything. We just have to send nothing, just this. This actually executes the request. Okay, so we sent the request, right? This one, configures the message, right? So we're saying we're getting. This one creates the object, creates the XHR object. That's what this does. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, so far. And what this is going to do is this send request is going to send stuff off to the server, and what we want is a response. But for the response to come back, it's going to be an event, right? An event. So if you're going to keep going down to this, we're going to listen for a response that comes back. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to the place where it has it, and we're listening for 2 different things, right? We want the ready state. When the ready state changes, we want to get an idea of what the ready state is and what the status code is. Remember, ready state 4, which is what we want, and status code 200. Those are the 2 things we want. Okay, so here it talks about this on ready state change. Guys, old code. We don't use it like this anymore, right? Instead, what we want to do is, this is not really step 4. I'm just set up the ready state event. Okay, or what we want to do is register, is the better way to say it. Register the ready state event. All right. Once we register the event, anytime that we get a response back, whenever the server decides to give us a response, this event will be triggered. In other words, xhr.addEventListener, and we want to listen for the ready state change. That's the event type. Now, there's 2 ways to do this. I could call a named function, or I could do the event handler right in here, like normal. So I could code it like this. Function, right? Just like normal. And this function here is the callback function that triggers. We can also use the other syntax that we saw before, which is fat arrow syntax. For now, let's just keep it like this, and we'll talk about the difference between one and the other. So this listens for the event that comes back with a ready state change. For now, let's do this. Let's do a console log. All right, and we'll say ready state change triggered. Ready state change triggered. Okay, we should get that back immediately, actually, right away, if this all computes. We don't know what it is that's going to come back, but we're going to get a response. All right, so let's try this out. So we're going back to the server, and I'm going to go to products, and it says, hey, look, ready state change triggered 3 times. Why 3 times? One, it's going to come back and say one type of state change. Second one is going to come back another type of state change. Third one has come back a third type of state change. So we got 3 responses back, and now we're ready. Once it's come back to the third state change, hopefully, it's going to be in the right state and the right status in order for us to know that the state has been successful. To verify this, we can do a couple of things. We can check to see if my request.ready state is in a proper format, right? Notice that request is there, the request object, right? And what we want is for the status to be 200, okay, like we said before. So it should kind of look like this. If my request.ready state is equal to 4 and my request.status is equal to 200, then we're good to go, okay? That's when we're good to go. Only then is when we're good to go, all right? So where does this request object come from? Well, it comes from the XHR object itself. So going back to our code, we're going to say that, just like it said here, if my request, right, not request dot animation frame, but just like it says here, request lowercase request, right, and it says dot ready state, and ready state should be in a ready state like this. I'm not getting any code hinting. Don't worry about that. If that's equal to, exactly equal to, what we're looking for, which is the number 4, right? Remember, this is exactly equal to the triple equals, right? And both things have to be true. So if my request state is equal to 4 and my request status, so request dot status, right? If that is exactly equal to 200, that is the perfect condition that we're looking for in order for me to do console log we're ready. Okay? That's when we know that the objects come back and it's properly read the address book.json file and we're good to go. Okay? Only then, if we know this. So there's a few steps here, as you can see. And by the way, this is going to trigger whenever it feels like. It's not going to trigger in a particular order, so don't expect it to. Let's try this back out and see if it worked. So, okay, so it says request is not defined at XML HTTP request anonymous. And I wanted to put it in there for you guys so you guys can see it. All right, because it's trying, but it doesn't know what request is. Okay, so that's interesting that it's a request. It's this. It's XHR, right? So going back to this in the code, what we want to do is replace request with XHR. All right, so now if you hover over, it means something. The XHR, if XHR, the XML HTTP request, is in ready state 4, and if the XHR XML HTTP request is in status 200, then we're ready, okay? And let's see if that's true by going back to this. We're ready, right? See how that's good? Ready means that we got the proper request back from the system. And by the way, if we go here, and we go to here, look what we get. We got ./addressbook.json, right, is good. We got a 304 here for addressbook.json. We actually read the address book in. It's inside of our data. Okay, this is important to understand. We already have it. We've loaded it in our XHR object. Our XHR object actually has the data that came from our addressbook.json. Okay? So, if this is true, we want to use the XHR, the response text, and print it out. Let's see what that response text looks like, right? So again, going back to our code, instead of doing this, we want to take our XHR dot, and now there's different objects here we can use. We can do response text. Here's our response text, right? And this response text is going to be responding with our JSON data, right? So if I go back to here, we should have my entire address book. There it is. Address book. We loaded this. We have a bunch of stuff. Now remember what we did? We have all these objects here. Well, what we want to do is I want to load up my address book I want to take my address book object, and whatever that XHR object is, I want to convert it into JSON, right? I want to convert it into JSON. And how do I do that? Well, let's go back to a thing. You might think JSON.parse, right? Which is one of the ways to do it. I'm just going to skip down here, right? So again, we've got our data URL. I've got my onReady state change. I've got my request. Comes back here as a response text. And now after I got my response text back, this is the full code. I want to convert it, right, into something that I can use, right? And so I can use JSON.parse, which we learned this week, right? And what JSON.parse will do is convert it into a JSON object. So if I was to do that, so if I took JSON.parse and I wrapped it around my XHR response object, which happens to be a string, that's what it comes back in. You can see that as a string by default. It converts this string into a JSON object that we can use. And now what we get in our response is an actual address book array where it's now data, my friends. Once we have it as data, I can load this data in, right? I can load this data in to an address book class, as an example, where the address book or an address book list that has an array of contacts, not an array of these things, all right? These things are, remember what they are? They are just raw objects. That's what they are. That are coming inbound. We need to serialize and then deserialize. So what's happened is somewhere down the line in our little simulation, someone has serialized all our data, that's me, inside of this format, right? With an address book that has a bunch of different contacts, right? We need to deserialize it and take it back in as a list of contacts. A list of contacts, which means I've got to take JSON data and convert it into a contact. We don't have such a thing to do. However, we do have our contact class, and we've made a toJSON, right? Well, guess what I'm going to do now? I'm going to take something that says from JSON, right? I'm going to set our values from JSON. So I want to set contact, right? Set contact. So one is we're going to get JSON data. We're going to convert our contact to JSON. The next one is we're going to set our contact. Set our contact. So we're going to do that down here. Set contact. We're going to get, this is in our contact class. We're going to take in a JSON data, right? So a contact that is in JSON format, JSON contact, right? Or we can just call it, we'll just call it JSON data, right? And usually what I want to do in the parameter is break it down with underscore, JSON data. So we take the JSON data, and what we want to do with it is when we set our contact, we want to take the JSON data and convert it into what it is, right? So remember that what I want to do is I want to take each piece of the address book, right? Each piece of the address book and convert it into a contact. That's what I want, okay? So the way to do that is I'm going to take my JSON data, my JSON contact, that's what it is, and I'm going to say something like this dot first name is equal to JSON data dot first name, right? This dot last name is equal to JSON data dot last name. There is no JSON data yet, right? And we don't have any types, so this is okay. This dot email address is equal to JSON data email address. This dot contact number is equal to JSON data dot contact number, right? And so on. One more time. This dot short message is equal to JSON data short message, right? So now I have a means of setting my contact with stuff that I get from JSON. Does that make sense? So I'm loading it up, and I want to create a contact that is my JSON data. I don't have to do this because I can use the JSON data that's raw. But if I want to adhere to the contact class protocol, which is up here, then what I want to do is convert it. So now I can do other things. Remember, contact right now is just a series of, it's a, my contact itself is just a class that has some data members, right? But I also have a toString method, and I can have other methods that are useful for me to manipulate my contact that I normally cannot have straight out of the box with, using JSON the way we have it set up. Unless inside of my address book I have methods in here too, which is a little bit redundant, but we could. So that's what this does. So we want to be able to do this now. I want to take my response object and assign it to something. So if I say something like let address book, right, equal to JSON.parse, right, this part, JSON.parse XHR response text. And if I want to print out address book now, right, this is not correct. It's actually, this would be the raw data. Data is this, the whole piece, including the address book. And what I really have is, I want to say that, I'm just going to break it down two parts here. Address book is equal the data.address book. Okay, do you understand this? Because data, right, it's all of this, including the curly brace. It's the whole object. The object has an address book array inside of it. Okay? So when I JSONify this thing and turn it into a JSON object, right, then what happens is I get the whole object back, right? Not just the address book, but even this part. Because I can have multiple other objects in here. My address book, I can have a bunch of other address books too, right, with different pieces of data, right? So if I want to get this array, I need to access it by calling it property address book, right? So inside of my app.js, then I want address book is the thing I want to print. Address book, okay? So now what do I get if I did this? One thing at a time, I get this. I get what looks like an array, and my array of 4, that's what I get, and each object in my array, if you notice, right, is a contact object, but it's not quite coded as a contact object. It's coded as an object, a generic object prototype, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to convert this address book, each one of the objects in my address book, to a contact, right? So let's call it contact lists, all right? So I want to say that we're going to do a for loop. So remember we did different ones, right? There's for in, for each, for of, right? If I do a for in, it says, does the thing have a property? So this is not the one I want. But if I do a for of, right, I can say that for every contact of my address book, right, I want to say that I want to create a new object, a new contact. So and maybe I shouldn't say contact, but maybe I should say for every record of my address book, because I can have more than one record in my address book, let my contact be equal to a new contact object. Okay, I want to make a new contact. And then what I want to say is contact dot, because it's a new contact, I want to say objects.contact, because that's what it is. I'm using the objects.contact thing because contact is inside of an object's namespace, right? So I want to say let my contact be of type new objects.contact, and I want to take my contact and I want to set contact to the record, whatever the record is. Okay, for every one of them. And then, if I want to make a contact list, I'm just really being verbose here. You don't have to do it this way. If my contact list is equal to an array, right? My contact list is an empty array. Then what I can do is I can say that I want to append, right? I can say that contact list dot push my contact. Okay, so for every record in the address book, let my contact be a new contact. I'm taking the basic constructor that has default values of nothing, just a bunch of strings. And then I'm using my set contact, method, which I just wrote, set contact, to take my JSON data and convert from JSON into my contact, actually align my contact properly. So I am deserializing. I'm taking from JSON and making it into a contact. Okay, that's what I'm doing. Again, I'm doing this heavy-handedly. I don't have to do it this way, but I'm doing it to show you how it can be done. Okay, so, and I'm doing this all inside this if statement because I know for sure in here and only in here that I've loaded my data properly. That's when I know it's happening. I can't do it outside of here and say, okay, call this function now. No. It's got to be from in here, right? Because this is where my ready state change is correct and my status is 200. Okay, so this is going to build up my contact list. Cool. And when I'm done, let's show the contact list. So console log, if we're successful, we should be able to show the contact list here, right? And you're going to see very little difference between my original JSON data and my contact list. In fact, I'll show them together. So I'll say, hey, what does the address book look like? What does my data look like? Here's my data. Actually, my address book would be the closest one. My address book and my contact list will be almost identical. Let's take a look at that. So console log, address book, and we'll stop here for today. Here's my address book, here's my contact list. They should be almost identical. Almost. But let's see what we actually get. Ah, look at that. Look at the difference. So we have two arrays. Here's my address book. My address book is a bunch of objects, right? 4 objects. Object. We don't know what they are, but they're a bunch of objects configured in whatever way we want. Okay, yay. Awesome. But now, instead of objects, we have 4 contacts, and they're of the contact prototype. Here, they're just a anonymous object. That's what they are. Here, they're a contact. And with a contact comes all the benefits of being a contact, which means I can make methods run on those contacts. I can convert them into strings. I can do whatever I want with them. I have so much more control because I've converted it into a class that I have control of, right? And so I prefer this methodology from converting my data. I could keep it here, totally. I could totally keep it here and it's not going to hurt me. I can do whatever I want to do with it in my products page. But I'd rather do it like this. Are you with me? I keep hearing people departing. Are you with me? Check mark. So I got 1 check mark. Nushig. Okay, cool. And maybe Joseph and Tiago and Amanda. I know there's a lot of stuff, guys. But the idea is I've read in. Thank you. I've read in a file, right? And I've confirmed that I can read in a file, right, using my addressbook.json. I've read in this address book file. From my file, I've read it into my page, into my products.html page, right? Right now, it's just in data format, right? It's in my contact list, okay? But guys, once I have a contact list, right? And by the way, my contact list is locked in here, okay? That's what my contact list is. Remember what I can do with this thing, right? As I read my contact list, I can build up something else, right? I can build up something else. I can wait for this to finish. Once I finish doing stuff, and again, I've got everything in this one step here, right? But what I can do is, now that I have my contact list, I can create my, and I'll do this really quickly here. I want to create a UL, an unordered list. And I want you to think about it like this. Here, let's take a look at getbootstrap.com for a second. All right, so here's getbootstrap.com. And I'm going to go to some documentation. So here's my documentation for Bootstrap. And on the left, we have components. Going back to this again. And guess what I want? I want a table, right? Some kind of table component or something that's going to show me a table. And it could be under content. Yes, tables. Here we go. So I want this content, right? Here we go. Table. In my table, I want a table header, right? All this kind of stuff. And I want to put in some stuff inside my table. So this is the table that I want. And I want this table to be inside of, I want it to be something that looks like this, maybe with with a header and some information in here, and I want it to be formatted in a nice way. Something that maybe looks like striped rows. So tables striped. I like tables striped, and I do like the header being table dark, right? So let's copy this, format this table, right? And I can go into my products page. I know I'm running out of time, guys, but I'm going to stick around for questions after. I can go into my products page here, so products.html, and inside of my main, right, where I have my Jumbotron with products, right, which is okay, that's fine. I could put in a table that's in here. So I'm going to put a table, and my table is not going to have data. So this table body, right, it's going to be empty. Okay, it's going to be empty. So here's my table header, and my table header, I don't need this necessarily, right, the number, but I do need first name, last name, right, and I want here email address or contact number. I think it's contact number and then email address. And then email address. Hear me out here for a second. And now I'm going to deserialize my data so I can see this stuff right here. Email address, right? And let's say just I need these things, these first name, last name, contact number, and email address. I don't care about my message, okay? That's going to be something else that I have. But I want these 4 things, and it's table dark for my header, right? And I also want to do, from a table options perspective, so this is the table. I want a dark heading, right? And I also want a, I want to have it striped. So where it says class table, table dark, table striped. All right, I want to use that as something that I want. So table dark, table striped. All right, and if I just do this on my page, and let's go back out to my page here, which is on the products page, I'm going to start getting to look, it's going to start looking like a table. First name, last name, contact number, and email address, right? Okay. I want to populate each of these things here with data, right, as I go. And the way to do that is to add in the table body, right? And this will be the table body. So class, this will be the contact table. I'll make an ID. ID is equal to contact table, right? Here's my contact table. And what I want to connect is into the table body, right? So the table body of my contact table, all right? I could just put in table body, right? I want to get this element, table body, and I want to inject stuff inside here. I want to create elements to inject in here. And if you look at Bootstrap, you can see that I want a TR, which is a table row, and I want this data to go into it. A table row with a closing table row and some kind of data. Okay, I want to take this and put it inside of my app.js. All right, and let's just trial it out inside of a template string like this. Okay, so here's my table row, right? And I'll make sure that it's spaced properly so you can see it properly like this. Here's my table row. Here's my table row. Okay, let's put it in different rows. Doesn't really matter, guys, because the HTML will interpret it the way it does. So scoped row, I don't need this. Table header, right? This is for the row. This TH stuff. I do need the table data, right? So this is my table data. I'm just formatting it so it looks nice here, okay? So you can see it like this. So mark, instead of mark, I'm going to put in the list that I'm going to go through, okay? So this is the data that I want, and I want first name, last name, contact number, and email address. Bear with me, guys, one more second. I know I'm running late, but I want to show you this complete thing, and then I'll put it up to GitHub, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. So there's 4 pieces of data. Don't worry about what the data is, and some kind of table row that I'm going to inject inside of a this new stuff. Do I really need this table row right? Because table row is something that I want to create inside of my table body. And the answer is yes, I need a new table row. And then I'm going to attach each piece of table data. So that's what I really want, okay? So imagine if I had a for loop. Okay, again, I'm going to make another for loop. You can do it in one, but I'm going to do it in another for loop here. I'm going to say for, and I'm going to do a for of, again, just like we did before, another for of. And the iterator this time is going to be contact. For every contact of the contact list this time, again, you can do this all within this for loop up here. But I'm doing it because I want to show you how you can kind of create the data on your table. We're already on the table. I'm looking for this information. I want to go document.create element, and the element that I want to create is a TR, right? That's the TR element. So that's the surrounding element, this part. Okay? That's this part. And then what I want to do is I want to append to the TR, append child, this information, or and even easier is inner HTML. So I want to say that let's create this stuff, the new elements. We'll say let new TR, so table row. We'll say let row equal to document.create element, right? And then once I create the row, I want to say that the rows.inner HTML is equal to this, right? Except that we're going to be a little bit more strategic in how this looks because we're a little crazy. And what I want to do is I want to take the data from my contact. So I want to say something like, remember how we did this? So I want to take the data from my contact and inject it in here. Contact dot first name, right? Contact dot last name, contact dot contact number, contact dot email address. Okay, so I want to do this. I've created a row, and inside the row I've configured its inner HTML to be all these table data. And now I want to append, right, to that particular place, the place that I want, which is inside of my let my table body equals to document.getElementById, something that I called table body in my HTML. Sorry, I know, guys, I'm running over. Please bear with me. Here's my table body that I'm connecting to, right? Makes sense? My table body. So I'm connecting to my table body. I've already got that here. I make a for loop to run through each of the contacts in the contact list. I create in the shadow DOM, in memory, a TR element, a table row. And I attach all the data inside of a template string as inner HTML, right? And at the end, the beautiful thing is, I want to append child, the new row. So this does full circle. I'm taking the elements from my list, I'm connecting them to the table body, and I'm attaching them one at a time, row after row, right? How does this look now on the page? If I did everything correctly, it should look like this. Right? And if you don't like the dark look, which I think I'm not liking because it's too dark for me, some people may like that, but I don't. You can just go back to the products.html page and change this table dark out. You don't have to mention table dark at all. And then you're good to go with table light. Take a look at that. That's all my data right there. Okay. So that's the way to get data from your address book. And again, in a roundabout way. We went in a roundabout way to get it. Did I have to go through that, convert it to a contact, and pass it back? No. I could have taken the JSON data and done this exact same loop right here. This loop that I did here, right, in this for loop, I could have done this with my address book, right? I don't have to convert it to a contact first. Hell, I could have even done it in in this little for loop. I could have done all this too in one loop. I decided not to, only because I wanted to show you what it looks like to convert. This is converting the JSON data to a contact, right? And this is taking the contact and pushing it out to the screen, right? I'm going to put this up on GitHub. So you have this. You're going to need this. So I'm going to go to GitHub. I'm going to go to, I'll say added or functionality. I know it's kind of, generic, to the products page. Okay. Questions around this, what I've done. Again. So every time I come back, it only works here. If I go back to services, nothing. And if you look inside the inspector, I shouldn't get an error, right? It doesn't give me an error, right, in here. Because there is no, this isn't the products page. It only works here in the products page, right? And notice it takes that extra second, right? That extra little go. Why? Because asynchronously, it's accessing that file that's local on my machine and doing a couple things here. I'm converting it into a contact, so I've got like a contact list now, a list of contact objects, and then I'm spitting them back out onto the page, formatted into this file. And if you actually look at source, so if I go to inspect, so let's do inspect, but this time instead of inspecting it, let's look at the elements of the page that I've created, because I used the creation type. This is what I made. I went into the table body, and in each one of these TRs, you can see what I've done. I've actually injected each of these TRs. This is what it actually does. It creates HTML for me, and so that I can display it in my table body. Okay. You'll be asked to do this in one of your assignments, almost exactly. I'm just showing you how to do it here, so you see how this works. Okay. Okay. If there's no questions, I'll stop. But if there's questions, any questions around this? Does everyone understand what I've done here? I know it's complex, and I know I lost quite a few people here, about 6 people over the last little while. They dropped off. Maybe they have other things to do, or they're going to follow along later on, or whatever. But the key here is serializing and deserializing data. Creating my file in a JSON type format, and then getting the file, the data back from a JSON type format into something that I can consume as as class objects or instances, if you will. Once I have them as instances, guys, it's like I can do anything with these things. I can manipulate them. I can use, like I can print, spit them out into a screen. I can put them inside of a web page. I can do whatever calculations with them. I'm halfway there into making this a web application, just like this. Okay. Okay, that's all I wanted to cover. I covered most of what you need for manipulating JSON and using stuff with, this is vanilla JavaScript. I'm not using any jQuery. When we come back next week, we'll hit this a little bit again, and I'll do it again with other data. All right, so let me stop. I'll stop recording this, and then we'll go to questions.